forward to your sharing with us and the students. And we hope and we look forward to an ongoing association. And I request Dr. Nitish Shandurnikar to take over the session with an introduction of him so that the students can begin to build that rapport. And we look forward to the session, sir. Thank you so much once again and welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Niti ma'am. It is with great delight that I welcome Shri Nitin Sridhar to this guest lecture organized by the Faculty of Journalism and Communication. I have had the good fortune of interacting with Nitinji over email. He had visited the Institute of Leadership and Governance, I believe in 2019, and for a research project that I was engaged in with our alumnus Rutvi Dattani. We had together conducted an interview with Nitinji, and since then have been following his work, especially on Advaita Academy. So again, a formal welcome to Nitinji, and I will now formally introduce him before he can begin his talk. So Nitinji is an author, speaker, and journalist, and he's based in Mysuru. He is also the chief curator of Advaita Academy. All of you may want to check up Advaita Academy's web portal after this lecture. And I'm sure Nitinji will also throw a bit of light on the kind of work that Advaita Academy is doing. So Advaita Academy is a portal dedicated to the Hindu philosophy of Vedanta. And he's also the consulting editor of Indic Today, which is a portal dedicated to promoting Indic culture and the activities of Indic Academy. He was previously the editor of India Facts, which is an online portal focused on Indian history, culture, and politics. And currently, he's pursuing masters in philosophy from IGNOU, New Delhi. He is an author of various books, variety of interesting subjects, and one of the book that you probably see on the screen, the poster cover. So his first book was Musings on Hinduism. He has also written books titled Samanya Dharma that enunciates upon general tenets of ethics as available in Hindu texts. And his most widely acclaimed book that you also see on the poster is Menstruation Across Cultures, a historical perspective, that is from 2019. He is an engineer by education and training, but I must commend him for doing absolutely wonderful work from the Indic perspective and from the Indic lens, and that is exactly the title of his talk today, is going to explore menstruation and womanhood from an Indic lens. Nitinji, we have students from all the 5 batches. So we run a bachelor's program, a master's program, and also a PhD program. And as part of the undergrad program, students study gender skills, gender and media. They explore gender writings from a communication perspective. And the postgraduate students study development communication. So what a lot of us study and explore in the topic that you're going to talk today is mostly from a Western colonial perspective. And we are very delighted that you are here with us today to introduce us to the Indic perspective. So I'm very sure that what the students are going to learn today through Nitinji's talk is going to be very new and is going to lend them a very interesting perspective to explore this important issue of menstruation and women. So I hand over to Nitinji, and I just make him the host. So just give me a moment, Nitinji. Nitinji, I've made you the host of the meeting.
Okay.
The meeting is already being recorded from my end, but if you still want to press the recording button and want to record it, that's also perfectly fine. I was hoping that we can factor in for Q&A session, which I request Komal or Shamika to moderate once you are done with your talk.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Please keep me informed of the time because I may overrun. So that's why. So that
Definitely.
yeah, we will keep some minutes in the end for Q&A. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
And before you start, I just want to convey that I may have to leave in some time, but we will stay in touch. And I hope that you have a very fulfilling session.
Sure, sure. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you all again. And please go ahead.
So let me begin with a small prayer. Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. सदाशिवासमारम्भां शङ्कराचार्यमध्यमाम् अस्मदाचार्यपर्यन्तां वन्दे गुरुपरम्पराम्. First of all, I'm very, very thankful to Nidhi ji for inviting me and for welcoming me warmly. And I'm very happy to be addressing all the students, especially today journalism and the faculties, the colleges of journalism usually are known to churn out completely deracinated narrative of Indian history, culture, and all. So, in that background, I'm very happy that I'm able to address the budding journalists, budding media professionals in certain nuances of tradition and culture, uh, which are very important to understand India better, to understand Indian issues better. So before I jump in with my presentation, I want to give this background why this talk is important. Uh, Most of you are aware of the Shabarimala issue that happened, that was in news a few years back, and much of the media narrative were completely misinformed. I mean, uh, to understand a Hindu tradition, a Indian cultural religious practice, we need to understand the framework on which these practices are based. Without understanding that, merely applying frameworks borrowed from the West, for example, the notion of equality, the notion of women's rights in a non-nuanced and imposing manner leads to a lot of confusions, lot of misconceptions, and lot of uh, intellectual and epistemic violence, so to speak. So this menstruation across cultures was actually written in the background of the whole Shabarimala issue, wherein a great confusion was created by the media narrative. So this book sought to address this misunderstanding about Hindu practices, about Indic practices of menstruation. So I'm hopeful that I will be able to give you a better perspective of the menstruation, the practices some of you might be seeing in your own house, your grandmothers, your mothers practicing, or you yourself practicing some of the practices like not going to temple during your periods, some of the practices like um, some kind of segregation, though that is hardly practiced today. So these are the things that we'll be discussing. But more important, we'll be discussing the intellectual and theological basis of Hindu practices to understand what's the essence of the practice and why it is so. The questions of how and why and what, right? So, so let me just start share my presentation and then we will take it. Is this visible?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yes, it's
Okay.
visible.
Yeah. So the title of today's presentation is Menstruation and Womanhood, an Indic Perspective. So I will be focusing before moving into menstruation practices and what Indian traditions say. I'll be trying to locate the whole issue in the framework of womanhood, in the framework of, if we have to use it, technical term of Sri Dharma. But before moving further, I have just, can you, so this was a tweet from 2019. US Embassy in Nepal posted this. Basically, they want to wish people for their festival, Deshain, Tihar, and Chat Parva. But just see what they are doing. They are creating a narrative. They're saying, wishing you and your family a menstrual restriction-free festival. And the, this this woman, presumably a menstruating woman, is outside. She is not allowed inside. She is restricted. So uh, the image is created that this practice is somehow morally wrong, morally regressive, morally incorrect, and this needs to be overcome and transcended so that we can become modern people. We can celebrate in an equal manner. So this is the narrative that they want to create. So the question arises is this is a mainstream narrative in media, academia, and everywhere, wherein it says when I say Indian culture, when I say Hindu culture, I use them more or less synonymously because there cannot be an Indian identity, Indian culture without the basis of Sanatana Dharma. So the Indian culture treats menstruation as impurity. The Hindu views are rooted in superstition, and we degrade women by degrading menstruation. This is the narrative. This is the narrative prevalent in media and academia, and you saw that how the Shabarimala issue was reported. That was a very good example, case study, so to speak. But how true is this representation? That is the question, and I will be addressing them shortly. But before that, let me just briefly mention the background or how we should approach menstruation to properly understand it. And this is a given thing, of course, because though it is a given thing, we don't usually appreciate. Menstruation is a natural biological process that everybody knows, right? And that women undergo a majority part of their lives, month after month, they undergo the period. But the whole cycle is much more larger. It is not just the 3 days of bleeding that happens, but the whole cycle is connected to woman's fertility cycle, her ability to become a mother, right? In many a sense, because of the central role that menstruation plays in a woman's life, where its relationship to fertility and motherhood, it is closely associated with the notion of womanhood itself. What defines a woman? What makes a woman and different from man? And so this is how the cultures across the world, not just Indian culture, not just Indian civilization, across the world, all cultures understand womanhood in this way. So menstruation has always played an important role in how various societies and cultures perceive women, the nature and dynamics of man-woman relationship, the role of women in society as a whole. All of them have basis have been defined in certain way by their notions and practices related to menstruation. In Indian cultural and religious traditions, the menstruation, which is called in Sanskrit as Rajashrava or Rajasvala, and it is located within the larger canvas of Stri Dharma. And I will come to it. What is Stri Dharma? And this notion, this situating menstruation within the Stri Dharma, by doing this, it enunciates upon how deeply menstruation defines femininity and womanhood. But this basis, to understand this conceptual basis is important because without this appreciation, what I'm going to say next is will not make much sense. So what is this Sri Dharma? What is the, um, what is Dharma? I don't know how many of you are familiar with the concept of Dharma. What it
Nitinji, can
means.
I interrupt? We
Yeah,
cannot see your screen now.
yeah, I just stopped the sharing. I'll reshare it. As
Okay,
an,
okay. Sorry. Yeah, sorry.
yeah, yeah. Because I could not see anybody's faces, so I thought I'll just stop for a while and see. So, so what is this concept of dharma? And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the notions of dharma to what extent, but I will just go with a, basic concept, basic definition, a very quick, because dharma is such a vast subject. We can do 1 hour lecture on that itself, right? In the Shastras, dharma is usually translated as religion today, as ethics, as righteousness, as law. So many definitions, and no translation captures it fully. So let us return to the very etymological meaning of dharma. Dharma means dharayati iti dharma. Dharma is that which upholds. It upholds the universe, it upholds the individual, it upholds the community, the family, and everything. But what does actually upholding mean? So in one of the texts, there is a definition. I think it is a Vaisheshika Sutras, if I remember correctly. The definition basically says that dharma refers to all the actions, all the lifestyle choices that facilitate an individual to attain. It says two things: attain abhyudaya and nishreyasa. And these are very technical terms. The abhyudaya means material welfare, welfare in the mundane world. You know, the artha and kama. It may be uh, attaining the desires in the world. And nishreyasa is spiritual welfare. Spiritual is not a completely correct term, but we can take it for now. Nishreyas is otherworldly welfare. It gives one punyam. It also gives a punyam, karmic merit. And it also gives purification of the mind that helps one to attain, travel in the path of ultimate spiritual emancipation, the moksha, right? So dharma is this, that dharma refers to all those actions that facilitate one to attain abhyudaya nishreyasa, the overall well-being of an individual. And adharma is opposite of it, which leads to sorrow. Now, what is Stri Dharma? The term Stri Dharma can be understood as dharma concerning women, dharma that applies to women, that is, all those actions that facilitate women to attain overall well-being. I mean, this is a Shastric term. It is merely saying that, look, these are actions leads to this kind of welfare. Whether you do it or not is an individual choice. Sri Dharma can also refer to those duties, those actions, those lifestyle choices rooted in womanhood and hence are unique to women and facilitate them to overall well. A fundamental understanding behind this notion of Sri Dharma is the notion that Dharma is not a one size fits all thing. It is not a suggestion that like a 10 commandment, everything applies to everybody. It's not like that. We have something called Samanya Dharma, which applies to everyone, but that is only one part. We have something called Vishesha Dharma, a special Dharma, which is tailor-made for each individual based on his gender, based on his or her gender, time, location, mental temperaments, their age, everything, so many different factors, right? So when we speak about Sri Dharma and Purusha Dharma, these are certain duties which are specifically mentioned, which are specifically useful, which are specifically relevant to man or a woman, and which are helpful for them to attain overall well-being, to attain self-actualization. It is in this context of Sri Dharma that menstruation is to be understood, and this menstruation itself is called as the menstruation practices that culturally we have developed is called as Rajo Dharma. Rajo Dharma, Rajaswala, Raja means menstruation, Dharma is duties during menstruation, duties regarding menstruation or menstruation practices and restrictions, whatever. So Sri Dharma refers to those actions and duties that are rooted in womanhood, enriches femininity, feminine identity of women, empowers them, facilitates them to respect their own biological and psychological needs, and most importantly, helps them to live a life in sync with their womanhood and achieve self-actualization. What this implies is that if you root yourself in the notion of Sri Dharma, in the world view of Sri Dharma, in the framework of Sri Dharma, then you do not deny your womanhood. What do I mean by denying womanhood? For example, most of you may have watched this ad of Whisper and Stay Free and such other um, menstrual products. They say you wear the pad and suddenly you can win championship, you can run, you can swim, you can do anything. But what they don't tell you, what Ayurveda tells is that the woman during her periods must take rest. She should not perform any activity of physical exertion. No running, no swimming, because that affects her health. And it can affect the health of such women in a very severe manner. But the ads do not promote this. They hide these health issues associated with the life practice that they are promoting through the ads. And what they're actually promoting is they're saying, look, use this sanitary product, and then you can actually overcome, transcend your womanhood. You can kind of masculinize yourself. But locating oneself, if women locate themselves within the worldview of Sri Dharma, they are not denying, they will not deny their womanhood. They will not pursue an utopian genderless identity or a masculinized identity for themselves. And they do not want to escape their own biology. But instead, they will respect and celebrate their own womanhood and all that entails in it. And this perspective is very important if we are to appreciate the cultural, Indian cultural practices, Hindu cultural practices related to menstruation. So locating menstruation and menstruation practices within the framework of Sri Dharma not only imply that one respects and celebrates it, we will come to the celebration part in a bit, but it also implies that one recognizes menstruation and menstruation practices which are called as Rajo Dharma as a full-fledged practice of Dharma in itself. It is a practice of Dharma itself. It is a austerity in itself. It is a spiritual practice in itself that imparts punyam or karmic merit and is a sacred process in itself. I know that I have mentioned a lot of jargons in this here, a lot of jargons which you might find it difficult to absorb immediately. I'll be touching upon some of these concepts. I think we have another half an hour to touch upon the concept so that we can do some Q&A. I have more than 20 slides, so I won't be going through all of them. But some of the important concepts we need to touch, and they are very important so that you can appreciate. So let me restart this slideshow. So now there is a story from the Veda. In Indian culture, all knowledge is directly or indirectly traced back to Veda. So even the menstruation perspective and the practices can be traced back to a story in the Veda. And I will go through the story very fast. You can read the details in my book. Uh, the story, this is not a historical account. Please keep in mind, don't ask me when did it start, when did it happen. No, this story is an account. It is a hermeneutic. Its purpose is hermeneutics. That is, its purpose is to give a philosophical perspective on the issue. The story is Vishwarupa, the son of Swastra. He was a Vishwarupa is a priest, is a Purohit of the Devas, and but he was also related to Asuras. So, you know what happens when the yajna happens, the ahuti goes to the devas. But Indra suspected that Vishwarupa secretly gave the ahutis which were meant for the devas to the asuras as well, making them stronger. So Indra, the lord of the devas, the king of the devas, he went and cut off the head of Vishwarupa. Now, because Vishwarupa was a Purohita, was a Brahmana, this resulted in, and Indra killed him. So there was a sin. Sin is again a wrong term. There is a papam, a karmic demerit, an adharma of Brahmahatya, killing of Brahmana occurred to him. He tried to get rid of it. Please remember this is a story and keep your open mind because I'll come to the interpretation of it in a later after this slide. So Indra was unable to get rid of this papam because it was a very huge adharma, killing someone, especially killing a Purohita who was doing yajna. He appealed to the earth, the Bhumi Devi, requested her, please take one third of the guilt of this Brahma Hatya, so that I become free of that, and in turn I will give you a boon. So she agreed, Bhumi agreed, and this guilt of Brahma Hatya, one third of it, manifested as a natural fissure, the fissures that we see on the earth. And in turn, he gave her the boon that no matter how much humans dig the earth, with time it will be filled, and with it will not affect her in a serious way. She will be protected from that. And we see that, today humans dig the earth, we do mining and all. Time the nature rectifies all these issues. Similarly, then he appealed to the trees and requested them to take one third of this guilt of Brahmatya. They also agreed, and the guilt manifested as a sap. In the tree trunk you have the sap, so it manifested as a sap. And in turn, they got the boon that any amount of pruning, we cut the leaves and stems, branches, it does not kill the tree. Instead, it helps it grow further. So that was the boon. And finally, he came to the women and he said, please accept the remaining one third of the guilt of Brahmatya and help me become free of this. In their compassion, the women also agreed. And in them, this guilt manifested as a stained garment. This is a reference to the monthly periods. And the boon they asked was that they are they will be able to obtain offsprings after after their menses, and they are able to enjoy sexual intimacy until the birth. And then the Veda says, this is from the Yajurveda Taittiriya Samhita, it says, because of the stained garments during her menstruation, others should not eat the food prepared for her. They should not touch her. They should not communicate with her. She should be allowed to have some kind of segregation, some kind of peace and isolation. Seclusion is a more better term. And there should not be any sexual intercourse during with the menstruating women. And they also suggest some other practices for menstruating women, like they should not anoint themselves, they should not comb themselves, they should not bath from the hairs, they should not brush, they should not cut their nails, they should not involve in spinning, weaving, and other physical exertion activities. Now, all this looks like a story, interesting story, and some might say, "What is this? It makes no sense. What is this Brahmana killer and all those things?" But let me unravel the story behind this, the philosophical, the principles that the story actually tells us. By comparing the manifestation of monthly bleeding with a natural fissure on the earth or a sap of a tree, what the story is actually saying is that, look, menstruation is a natural phenomenon. It's a biological phenomenon. There is nothing to be afraid of. It's a very natural thing. Today, our textbooks tell us something, in the high school, the biology textbooks tell us menstruation is a natural thing. You don't need to be afraid. This is something like that. And what is this papam? What is this brahmahatyam? What is this one third brahmahatya? This is very simple. What exactly happens in the biological cycle of menstruation? What is it? Every month, the woman's body gets ready, after puberty, the woman becomes, every month there is a cycle wherein the egg is produced, which is capable, which has a potential to be fertilized and give birth. So this is the cycle, the monthly menstrual whole cycle that is keep happening. But if the fertilization does not happen, then that egg is then removed during the menstruation. That the bleeding happens, the egg is taken out. This non-fertilization of egg is called as one third of Brahmatya. This is a Shastric discussion. Why it is called so, we will not go into that. This is merely saying that, look, Brahma means potentiality to create, because it is Brahmaji who creates the world, right? So Brahma refers to the potentiality to create. The Brahma Hatya means it is the cessation or the stoppage of this potentiality, non-realization of potentiality. So the one-third Brahmatya simply means non-realization of this potentiality, and this causes the color of guilt. That is what the text says. This causes ashaucha. There is an ashaucha associated with it, which is usually translated as impurity. I will come to that in a bit, what exactly it means. And it also says, the story also says that menstruation is a purification process which removes this guilt. It frees women from this guilt because they did not do it intentionally. It is a natural process. So they remove the guilt as well. And by associating menstruation with childbirth, it is saying that menstruation is a dharmic process to be celebrated. So what are the notions this story actually imparts? The notion that menstruation is ashaucha, it is austerity, it is a period of rest, it is a period of self-purification process, it is a celebration process. We will see this a bit in detail now. What is the time? Let me just check. Yeah. Ashaucha. Before understanding Ashaucha, let us understand what menstruation is. In Sanskrit, menstruation is called as Rajashrava, flow of Raja. What is Raja? Raja can refer to blood. At the physical level, it refers to blood. There is a continuous flow of blood. Everybody knows this. You all know this. But Raja also refers to Rajoguna. And it is in this context that Ashaucha refers to ritual impurity as well as incompetency for doing Vaidika Agama Karma. For example, Ashaucha means one cannot do puja, one cannot go to a temple. And why is it so? I will be explaining now. What is this Rajoguna? Again, these are a lot of conceptual things. I want you to reflect on this after the end of the session. I have delivered similar talks on YouTube. You can check it out for reflection, and you can read my book. That is the best way to do it, or to reflect on this. In the Hindu conception, we are not just the physical body. We also have the mind, right? We all know we think through the mind. Actually, the Hindu texts say that we have panchakoshas, 5 layers, of which the 3 layers are important. What is called Annamaya Kosha is the physical body, and then we have what is called as Pranamaya Kosha, or the vital body, which is about the the 5 kinds of life forces. The what is called as prana, apana, vyana, udana. These are inhalation, exhalation, and the processes like assimilation. All these activities in the physical body are controlled by what is called as prana. Prana is basically is a vayu. It is the life force which acts, facilitates the physical body to function. And then we have the mind, or a manomaya kosha. Now, the text say that if you have to do any spiritual activity, it may be puja, it may be meditation, it may be japa, whatever it is, you have to be in a condition of shaucha, or purity. Because it is shaucha, or purity, which gives you competency, adhikaratva, to become eligible to perform a spiritual sacred activity. And what does it mean? In physical level, shaucha means hygiene, no excretion, no flow of blood, and such things. The opposite, ashaucha, impurity, will mean there is some kind of non-hygienic activity. In the case of menstruation, there is a flow of blood. You may use tampon, you may use sanitary pads, but the flow of blood itself is not stopped. If there is an accident, it may be male or a female. In the case of accident, because there is a flow of blood, that person becomes incompetent to perform a puja after an injury, right? Similar like this. But in the case of menstruation, there is ashaucha not just at the physical level, but also at the level of vital and mind, vital body and the mind. At the level of the pranas, shaucha means there is a balance of the pranas. There is, the 5 pranas, prana, apana, vyana, udana. There is a balance in that. But during menstruation, there is an imbalance in that. Why? Because there is a increased apana vayu. Apana vayu is increased condition. Why is it so? Because what is the function of apana vayu? Ayurveda says the apana vayu's function is it's a downward moving life force. It's a downward moving vayu. It is responsible for causing the excretion, causing the removal of waste, causing the removal of urine and etc. But it is also the vayu which is responsible of throwing out the blood, causing the menstrual bleeding once in a month. So because the vayu is in heightened condition, it is working over time. So there is an imbalance in the pranas. Therefore, there is ashaucha. Similarly, in the mind, lot of women experience irritation during menstruation. This is a, I don't need to say this, all of you women know this themselves. They have irritation, mood swings, the pain, all these things happen during menstruation, during the 3 days periods. Because of this, they are in ashaucha, because shaucha means calmness of the mind. There is ashaucha or impurity, ritual impurity in the body, in the prana, and in the mind. So, what is this impurity here? It simply is a reference to the fact that the women are in the heightened condition of rajoguna, in the body, in the mind, and in the prana. Because of this heightened condition of rajoguna, what happens is certain actions become unsuitable to them, and they become unsuitable for certain actions. They become unsuitable, incompetent for certain actions like doing puja, going to temple, etc. Certain actions also become unsuitable to them. For example, doing cooking, doing physical exertion like running, swimming, etc. Because these highly physically intensive activities will affect their menstrual cycle, will affect their biology and cause health issues. Similarly, even this spiritual activities, because any spiritual activity, by definition, it causes the prana to rise upwards to whatever level it is. But during menstruation, apana is moving downwards. So it interferes with the menstrual activity. It interferes with the activity of the apana and hence affects the menstrual cycle of the women as well. Therefore, these restrictions are there in the tradition, in the cultural practices that we receive from our mothers, grandmothers, great grandmothers, and as well as from the Shastras, that women should take rest, women should not perform spiritual activities, should not perform japa, should not go to a temple, should not go to any marriage and such other sacred activities. It is not meant to oppress women, degrade women. No, impurity here does not mean inferiority or degrading or moral judgment. The moral judgment definition of impurity is in Christian theology. We have imported these meanings from Christian theology and copy pasted it on our Indian practice. In Hindu Dharma, ashaucha merely means, with respect to menstruation, that women are in a heightened condition of raja. But this is not the end of the story. Just because women are in ashaucha does not mean they are kept away from spiritual merit. Instead, what it says, our Shastra says that menstruation itself is a self-purification. It's a purificatory process. And it is an austere process. It is a dharma in itself, as I mentioned. What does menstruation purify? Ayurveda says that the monthly cycle, the 3-day period when it removes ama or toxins from the body, it removes the menstrual fluid, it contains the blood, vaginal secretions, endometrium tissues, the unfertilized egg, all these which are not required by the body, which may turn other toxins in the body, it removes all these things. So menstruation is a purification process which improves the health of the woman. It heavily affects women to improve their health. Secondly, the text also says that because apana vayu in heightened condition, there is a rajasic energy as well. As I said, menstruation is called as Rajashrava. It removes the excess Rajasic energy from the body, and by the end of the 3-day cycle, it restores the balance of the Tridoshas. It is not that Tridoshas are always in equal amount. No. Here, balance means they are in the natural condition. At different stages in the month, different dosha are in a heightened condition, right? Because that is how the body functions are affected. These are all Ayurvedic concepts. I understand that these may be little bit heavy aside, but still I request you to understand the essence of it, whatever I'm saying. The text, the Dharmashastra text also further says that the monthly cycle frees women from the adharma committed in the mind. The Dharmashastra says you can do adharma or papam, the unethical activity through the body, like you murder someone, you steal something, that is the crimes committed through the body. But you can also do it through speech. You speak harshly to somebody, you are rude to someone, you speak lies, you speak nonsense behind their backs. These are all adharma of the mind, of the speech. And then we have adharma of the uh, mind, that we think bad about somebody else, we think to harm somebody else. We cannot control our mind. We always have this anger and everything, right? So the menstruation is supposed to remove the papam or the dharmic demerit, the karmic demerit that is generated by mental adharmas. It purifies the women from that. More importantly, it also acts the therapeutic process, especially in case of women who have undergone rape and sexual assault. It helps if menstruation, the monthly processes, is seen as a tapasya or an austerity and practiced with that mindset. It frees them of feelings of hurt, depression, guilt, and such. So we need to understand this from a very spiritual, from a tapasya, austere perspective. What is interesting is that women's entering a temporary ashaucha during menstruation does not make them impure or inferior. The text like Baudhayana says that it makes them ever pure. Menstruation purifies women at physical, mental, and speech level. The same kind of purification to attain, men have to perform a lot of other activities like uh, japa, sandhya vandana, upasana, daily meditation, and so many other things. But women get this purely by undergoing the menstruation process, by segregating herself, by treating it as a tapasya and following the menstrual lifestyle, the Rajodharma or the Rajaswala Paricharya. So what comes by special effort to men comes as a natural process to women. So menstruation is a privilege to women and as a self-purification tool. It is not a burden. The ads show you that menstruation is a burden. They want you to make you free from menstruation. But the perspective of Sri Dharma says that it is not a burden. It is a privilege that only unique to women, and women must value it, respect it, and practice it. Similarly, menstruation is a tapasya. It's a period of rest, yes, but also a period of tapasya. You During the 3-day cycle, women do not need to do any other spiritual activity. They are not competent, but they are also not necessitated. They don't need to go to temple. They don't need to do puja or anything like that. The very practice of the menstrual lifestyle, like taking rest and other practices involved in it, not cooking, not doing physical exertion, just staying segregated from the family, uh, leading a brahmacharya kind of lifestyle, that itself is a tapasya. It involves indriya nigraha. So it gives great spiritual merit. And of course, the rest part is everybody know. The Ayurveda specifically says that rest is most important, avoiding physical exertion, taking rest, keeping the mind free from worry. All these are most important to keep the health of the women intact. Because any kind of exertion or stress results in imbalance of the doshas in the body, which leads to serious health issues, serious disturbance in the menstrual cycle as well. Now coming to the celebration part. So we have seen till now that from the perspective of Sri Dharma, Indian culture, Indian tradition locates menstruation within Dharma framework and considers dharmic practices, the menstruation practices as a dharma itself. As part of it says, it associates notions like ashaucha, which is ritual impurity, which makes them ineligible to perform certain kind of mundane as well as spiritual actions. But at the same time, menstruation itself acts as a purification tool, which is beneficial to her in a biologically, in a health perspective, but also in a dharmic perspective. It frees her from many kinds of um, unintentional, uh, everyday kind of adharma that we all indulge in on a day-to-day basis. And it is a tapasya in itself which gives spiritual merit. Now, coming to the other aspect, and this is more important, I said that menstruation is kind of defines womanhood. How does it do so? What is it that makes a woman different from a man? That woman is able to become mothers. A man can become a father. So the role of a man and a woman in a family or in a society is fundamentally different. Um, a man can become a father, a husband. He cannot become a wife or a mother. Similarly, the woman can become a wife or a mother, but she cannot become a husband or a father. So the woman's role, according to her own nature, is more oriented towards nurturing, but man's role is more oriented towards providing and protecting. So taking this all into consideration, the woman's biology itself is like that. The whole menstrual cycle, the month by month whole cycle is designed biologically, by naturally, to facilitate women to become mothers, to give child. Her body adjusts, you know, undergoing childbirth, pregnancy. It's a huge, takes a huge toll on the woman. I have a just 11-month-old child, a daughter, and I have seen the kind of toll it takes my wife. So the body, the biology, the whole thing of the woman's whole cycles are designed to help her. And this biology needs to be appreciated, respected, and celebrated. So menstruation is deeply connected to childbirth and fertility, and the whole cycle is a biological facilitator of motherhood. And therefore, because this motherhood is so central to womanhood and identity, self-perception of women, it is celebrated across India. The menarche ritual, which is called as Ritukala Samskara, is celebrated when the woman first starts menstruation. Today, this celebration has almost died out in northern and western part of India. It has survived somewhat in southern India and eastern India. But at one point of time, it was celebrated across India. The menarche marks a transition of a girl from Kumari to Kanya. It is equivalent to Upanayana that is done for the boys. The purification that the brahmachari boys attain to Sandhya Vandana, Kanya attains it through going through monthly menses. Menstruation makes women eligible to enter Grihastha, that is married life, facilitates them to perform Sri Dharma, including entering motherhood, which are unique to them. Celebration imports a positive perception of menstruation to a young girl, because then she's welcomed with open hands into womanhood. I have given these details in my book. I don't have time to elaborate on this. How the celebration gives a sacredity to the whole process. It imparts complete positiveness to the whole process in the minds of the young girl. Interestingly, Hindus consider their own devis, the goddesses, as menstruating and celebrate festivals in honor of them. The Navaratri is a very important festival. We have the Navadurgas, right? Have you wondered the first 5 Navadurgas refer to 5 different stages in a woman's life? Shailaputri is child, Brahmacharini is post-menarche woman, Kanya, Chandragantha marriage, Kushmanda pregnancy, Skandamata motherhood. This shows that Durga, in her form of Brahmacharini, presides over she is the presiding deity of menstruation. There are other forms like Gauri and all who are also associated with menstruation. Then we have deities like Kamakya, Harachandi, Bhumi Devi, who are worshipped as deities of menstruation. We have the famous Ambubachi festival in Assam, the Rajo festival in Odisha, Kedasa festival in Karnataka, wherein these deities are perceived as going yearly menstruation. And for 3 days, all activities are stopped, especially the farming activities are stopped, and the Devi is given rest. You cannot enter inside the temple of Kamakya for the 3 days. She is given rest. So, I hope I have been able to communicate these ideas of sacredity, of purification process, of austerity, of ashaucha associated with menstruation in Hindu tradition, and how all of them are rooted in understanding that menstruation is very central to womanhood, central to women identity itself. Now I will quickly take you through this Ayurvedic aspect because people don't appreciate it. As I said, today a lot of young girls and even women have a strong idea that it is normal to get pains during their periods, but this is not so. Ayurveda says a normal menstruation is one. I think here I have normal menstruation is one wherein there is no pain. See the first point. It is not associated with any kind of pain or a burning sensation, and the blood flow is neither very large nor very small. So there is something called as normal menstruation wherein there is no pain. This does not happen when a lot of women and they experience pain and other kind of discomfort because their menstruation is disturbed. It is called as disturbed artavam. Artavam is another name for menstruation. And this can be caused by a disturbed vayu, disturbed pitta, kapha, blood, all those, so many reasons. So Ayurveda says that to bring a balance in them, to ensure that disturbed condition change to undisturbed condition, it gives a lifestyle practice called as Rajaswala Paricharya. Charaka Samhita says, after the onset of menstruation for 3 days and nights, the woman should observe celibacy, should sleep on the ground, take food with her hands or from an unbroken utensil, and should not cleanse her body in any way. All these are important because having a bath, anointing yourself, all these activities during menstruation, during the 3 days bleeding, disturb the inner biological process. Similarly, celibacy is to be practiced. The food should not be consumed from a metal container, but from a more traditional means like a wooden pot or wooden containers or plates or something like that. This is taken from a Ayurveda paper published in a journal. Basically, it gives, according to Ayurveda, what are some of the things to do and to not do. Sleep on the kusha mattress or on the floor, observing celibacy. And this is important. Taking very simple food. eating meal made of ghee and rice and milk or barley. These are simple food. Avoid junk food, avoid outside food, take home food and take it in a very small quantity. And do not use metal utensils, use a clay utensils. Take food in less quantity and concentrate on auspicious things. Think about good thoughts. Do not be stressful. Things to avoid include running, laughing, massage, nail paring, bathing, anointment, crying, use of collyrium, sleeping during the day, fatigue, exposure to wind, combing, indulging in long conversations, because many of these are basically involve a lot of physical exertion, which seriously affects the health. Not just that, if these activities are carried during the 3 days periods again and again and again, it may have serious effect. It may affect seriously on the kind of child that is born in the future. That is what the Ayurvedic text is. This is the last column you can see. These are this mentioned the extreme cases. It is not that every time this happens. Extreme cases. Just last two slides are there. I think I rushed it pretty well. We can finish it in 5 minutes. Before coming to this slide, I'll just summarize this. Some of the practices that modern women like you can adopt include these. Food is very simple thing. Whether you're a working woman, studying, college going, whatever it is, during your 3 day periods, you can avoid outside food, avoid junk food, eat homemade food, avoid non-vegetarian food also because they are heavy, and eat very light food and eat less quantity of food. This is very simple thing, it can be very easily. And also avoiding taking food using metal utensils. That is also everybody can do. Observing celibacy is something people can do. Sleeping on a mat or a chairpoint and avoiding sleeping during the daytime is also easily done. Yes, it may not be possible to completely avoid taking a bath, especially if you are going out. But if you are at home, you can do this. But if you're going out, at least one can try to avoid body massaging, use of makeup and such things, because all these activities have a effect on the internal biological process. Physical work is another area that people can do, you know, trying to avoid, at least minimizing household activities, cooking, traveling, sports, taking a day or two off from your office work if possible. I support this new age concept of menstrual leave. It is not a new age concept. It is a old concept. Our grandmothers and great grandmothers took rest during their menstruation. Mental stress, trying to avoid stress, too much stress, work stress, other stress. Students can definitely do this. And religious activity, that is something I think most women already do. Avoiding spiritual religious activities like yoga, meditation, puja, visiting temples. Today we have a fast moving society, and it is very difficult to practice all the practices all the time. But it is definitely women can practice some of the practice some of the time based on their condition and day-to-day requirements. At least some of the practice, if they practice, then lot of health and medical benefits, physical and mental health benefits are there. So final comments, and this is very much relevant to journalist students. The modern narrative on menstruation is predominated by Western cultural views rooted in modern scientific worldview, and it is derooted from its sacred dimensions. The non-physical aspects, for example, in your biology textbooks, in your sex education classes, all these cultural practices would have been called as a taboo, as a superstition. What is worse is they have reduced menstruation, the experience of menstruation, to merely a negative notion, such as pain, cramp, and posited it as an unavoidable annoyance to be overcome. You know, these drugs, the pills that you sometimes women take to postpone the menstrual periods, the advertisements I refer to about Whisper and Stay Free that want you to overcome menstruation. So these are all very unhealthy practices. These are all not only unhealthy in a physical way, but also in a deeper social, cultural, and psychological way, because these notions are alienating women from their own womanhood. They're kind of promoting a masculinization of women. Modernity posits menstruation as a purely biological phenomenon from whose enslavement one must free themselves. That is the point I just made. The very names like Stay Free and Whisper induces shame and feelings of suffocation towards menstruation. Underlying message is one must overcome the bondage of menstruation, and these products help towards it. The obsession with particular scientific biological narrative of menstruation has alienated women from their own bodies and bodily experiences and cultural experiences, and prevented them from discovering a positive meaning to the process as part of their self-discovery. I'll give you one example. There was a sociological, anthropological survey in Odisha among the rural women of Odisha about their menstrual practices. And do you know what they say? They said they undergo menstruation just like the universal mother, the Shakti, who also undergoes menstruation once a year. They are like her. Their 3-day period of menstruation is not merely a bodily process, but it is a cosmic event which contributes in the maintenance order in the universe. This may sound primitive to a modern, urban, deracinated, educated people like you and me, but let us pause for a bit and compare. The modern narrative is women should get rid of menstruation because it is full of cramps and pain and everything negative. But here is a woman, rural woman, who is not learned in modern education. She says that menstruation is good for me. This is a good thing. It is a positive thing. It is a divine thing. It's a sacred thing. It is a cosmic thing. See the difference. There is positivity on one hand and negativity on the other side. Not just that, if you go deep into the Hindu cultural, traditional, and knowledge systems, you will recognize that there is a deeper truth in what the rural woman says. That menstruation is indeed a deeper process. It is Rajo Dharma. It is a dharma which gives Abhyudaya and Nishrayasa. It is indeed, we people, we are humans, we do not exist in a silo separate from the rest of the universe. We are not the masters of the universe. This is a modernity narrative, anthropocentrism. In the academic terminology, it's called anthropocentrism, whereas man is the master, man is the sole important thing, and the rest of the world is for his domination so that he can dominate them. This is a very cruel and perverse narrative of the modernity rooted in Christian theology, but also in modern scientific narrative. But we do not subscribe to that. We subscribe to the notion of cosmology, wherein we humans are like many other beings, inseparable part of this universe, and our actions affect the universe, and universe affects our actions. So the village woman has a deeper perspective and meaningful perspective on life than an urban educated woman. This needs to change. So, in the name of freeing one from cultural taboos, modern scientific education is promoting unscientific practices harmful to the health of the woman. For example, positing, indulging in running, swimming, etc., as freedom. On the other hand, Hinduism or Indian cultural and religious practices, as we see in the whole presentation, it promotes a positive, austere, purifying, and healing process. You know, funny. in the West, nowadays, there is a movement called Red Tent Movement, wherein they are asking women to do just this. They say that women should segregate from their families, live in a red tents outside of the families, and with other women menstruating at the same time, and celebrate and observe and respect their femininehood, womanhood. When the same thing was been practiced in India for thousands of years, that is demonized as outdated and superstition and degrading of women. But the West themselves are doing it now. See the irony. So, as a journalist students, as a students who will be going into mass media and dealing with lot of these issues, my request, my suggestion, my advice is to never approach Indian cultural and civilization and religious practices with a modern lens, with a lens of equality, with a lens of freedom, gender, these lenses may not always work. In fact, 99% of the time, they do not work when you apply to Indian realities, Indian cultural notions and practices, because these are alien to us. We need to understand our practices from their own perspectives, from their own lens, the Indic drishti, so to speak. And Shabrimala was a good example. An Indic drishti says that each deity is unique. There is no Abrahamized version of one God, God, with a capital G. Each deity is unique, and each deity has his or her own likes, dislikes, and special qualities. And in Shabrimala, Ayyappa is a brahmachari. Therefore, there are certain rules of the temple. The same Ayyappa Swami in other temples is not a brahmachari, and there anybody and everybody can go. There is no risk. So these nuances will be missed, even with respect to menstruation, femininity, Sri Dharma, all practices, starting from sati to menstruation, every practice can be demonized by using a wrong framework to understand. If you use a right framework, an indigenous framework in which the practices have developed, then you will be able to better appreciate. Whether you practice it or not is an individual prerogative. There is no compulsion, there is no imposition. Every person can make his or her own decision. But we need to have a proper understanding. So with this, I will conclude my presentation. I hope you all enjoyed my presentation. I'm open to questions. Even after this session, I am active on Facebook and Twitter, and you can write to me on email as well if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nitinji. I think for a lot of us present in the session, a lot of the concepts and a lot of the arguments being made were very different, were very new from what we have been trained and from what we have been trained to understand, accept, and pass on. So thank you so much. I think a few of our students have read your book. I'm not sure if they are in the meeting or not. But even in our own understanding of gender and media, we do try and pass on this message that of course, we do need to study Western frameworks and do need to go through them because they are a part of our academic syllabus. But we must also be cognizant and, as you said, appreciative of the Indian frameworks that are available to us in understanding not just menstruation, but a lot of issues pertaining to gender. I now invite Komal to moderate the Q&A session. Komal is doing her PhD thesis on the representation of the LGBTQ community in mainstream Bollywood movies. So Komal is here with us. Komal, can you take over the Q&A session?
Yes, ma'am. Yes. Hello, sir. Thank you for such an insightful session here. I'm sure that some of the students might have doubts, questions, confusions. We would want students here, like agar abhi connect karna chahte hain, abhi if they have further questions, if they want to connect with you personally, I'm sure you have shared your Facebook and Twitter account handles. They'll connect with you there. But right now, anybody wants to has a question, please go one by one.
I think Nirzari has a question. Nirzari, can you please unmute yourself? Okay, I don't think Nirzari is able to unmute herself. So Komal, you can read her question.
Yeah, so the question is, does a Sri Dharma concern with women, the gender, or female, the biological sex? So I guess she wants to know, like, is it just with the women or the female sex, biological sex?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question and a controversial one, I would say, because my answer may not be of liking to many of you. So let me, before directly come to the answer of what Sri Dharma is, we need to understand in a Hindu perspective, there are three kinds of gender, and we do not differentiate per se between sex and the gender, right? There are three kinds of gender. One is Purusha, the second is Stri, and the third is Tritiya Prakriti. The Purusha is both biologically, psychologically, in every way, is a man. So it's a male, gender-wise as well as even sexual, what you call as biological sex. A Stri is biologically as well as in a sense of a gender is woman. The rest, everything, wherever there is this mismatch and confusion, and today what goes by different names and letters, they are called as Tritiya Prakriti, wherein usually it refers to transgenders, it may refers to even the people LGBTQ and all those people. So it is called as Tritiya Prakriti. Tritiya means third. It's a third gender, so to speak. There are two plus Purusha Dharma. So Purusha Dharma refers to the Purushas, similar Stri Dharma with respect to Stri. So it refers to Stri in a full sense of the word, that is, who is both biologically women as well as in a gender sense also. So I hope that answers.
Nitinji, there is a connected question that I want to probably put.
Yeah.
So usually we talk of the LGBTQ spectrum, and it is now very well known that even Indic cultures have an entire gender spectrum. It's not just male and female, but it's an entire spectrum. We always had gender diversity in our existence in the way we are. So in this context of gender diversity that the Indic culture and Indic texts promote, how do you see what Nirzari is asking?
See, I think there is no confusion here. See, the texts are very clear when they speak about Purusha Dharma, Stri Dharma, and there is something called a Samanya Dharma, which is applicable to everyone. So the beauty of Samanya Dharma is it does not take into account either gender or place, location, your varna, ashrama, or anything into account. It is equally applicable to say a black person in Africa or a white person in America or brown person in India or any of the people in the gender spectrum, whether you take in the modern language of LGBTQ and plus plus plus, or in the Indic community, Indic language terms, we have lot of different terms, in, both community wise but also in Shastric wise. The Samanya Dharma equally applies to everyone. But what is called as Stri Dharma and Purusha Dharma refers to specifically the men and the women and the heterosexual institution of marriage. So Vivaha is I have recently written an article in the light of, there was a petition in the court to consider homosexual unions as a Vivaha in a Hindu sense under Hindu Marriage Act. So in that context, I have written an article saying, examining whether homosexual unions can be considered as a Vivaha. Vivaha is a technical term, is a Shastric term. It is not just a sexual union. Um, it has a religious connotation. It's a samskara. So I have shown there that Vivaha by definition is a heterosexual institution. So a homosexual union cannot be designated as Vivaha. This does not mean that homosexuals are somehow wrong or nothing like that. They can be together, they can love each other, they can live together, they can do whatever they want. But that union cannot be designated as a Vivaha. And secondly, this also does not mean that just because these third gender people do not come under Purusha and Stri and do not are not competent to practice what is called as Purusha Dharma and Stri Dharma, does not mean that they are excluded from Dharma. They have Samanya Dharma, which they are eligible, which everybody is eligible. More importantly, they have, if they're willing to pursue a spiritual path, there are different options of spiritual path even open to them. Yoga, bhakti, so many other paths are there. So nobody is excluded from dharma, but there is no one size fits all. One size shoe fits everybody. That prescription is not there in. I hope this further clarifies.
Yes, yes. Yes, Komal.
I guess now Krishna has a question. Krishna, can you please speak? Yeah. Please unmute yourself.
Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Good afternoon, sir. And I'm very happy to hear you. Like I had a great time listening you. Thank you. Well, I have a question that what is the role of men in women menstruating? For example, you said according to Ayurvedic terms that woman has to be happy. She does not have to work. She has to be at most in her comforting time. But then the domestic work, who will do that? Are there kids, or then the patriarchy role comes in where the mother-in-law will work? Where will the are men ready to come in the at that time I'm talking about? Is there anything defined in our Hinduism that while men are menstruating, then how the men will overcome the domestic work and everything? And this question also comes because somewhere I have read one theory. It's I don't know. One theory it's just an argument was that men why menstruation became a taboo because men were in patriarchy. Men started being very much dominating. Men became so much dominating that they tried to control everything of a woman, but they couldn't control the periods, they couldn't control the menstruation, the blood, because that was not in their hands. It was something very natural process. So men were not able to control this, and that is why they made it a taboo. This is maybe this not be true, but this is something not logical also. It's very much logical. So my question is that what is the role of men in menstruating? Like it's because their ego and a lot of things that comes at the role of men is my question. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Nikhilji, your voice is breaking.
2 days back, I was part of there was a festival, Hindu Women's Festival, organized by an organization in UK. It's in, you can do it in YouTube search. The title of the panel was Role of Men, in family, in society. And I speak on exactly this topic. What is the role of men? And I would briefly elaborate on that. But before I do that, I think a lot of what you suggest is a very common theories of patriarchy and all. These are all just theories. I would go ahead and say that these are all just theories with hardly any evidence to it that see, all systems, all institutions everywhere in the world, they will be misused, open to misuse in one way or the other. There cannot be, it is a utopia which will never be fulfilled to create an ideal system. You cannot create an ideal system. It is impossible. So understanding this, we should understand that every system has its faults, but that system cannot be defined by the faults rather than by the fundamental principles of the system. Consider this so-called patriarchal, I would say it is more a patrilineal system, which is Hindu Dharma or Hindu society is. And what is the role of men? Yes, there is three dharma. In a Dharma Shastra, open any portion, there is a small section on Sri Dharma, but 3/4 of that book, though it does not go by the name Purusha Dharma, it is actually Purusha Dharma. More duties, more responsibilities are put upon the men than on women. So that is one aspect. But let me share with you a verse that I shared. This is from Manusmriti, which is most abused today. But what does that say? Pita tu rakshati kaumare, bhartru tu rakshati yavane. And it says, second line is there, I just don't remember. What it basically means is, when the girl is small, it is a duty of the father to protect her. When she has grown up in her youth and is married, it is the duty of the husband to protect her. And when she is in old age, it is duty of the son to protect her. It is a basically it is a instruction to men about their duties. What does this protection here mean? It is a very wide sense. It is not in the normal, simpler sense that we understand. Here, protection not only means a physical way of protection, like protecting your family members from harm from the outside, but also it means that a man is bound to act in such a way in the society that he does not abuse his position, he does not violate others, he is not violent towards others as well, women of other households as well. Second, it also means, I return to this notion of nurturer and provider and protector. Protection also implies providing. In a traditional setup, in a pre-colonial, pre-industrial revolution across the world, this was the societal setup which was there, and it worked fundamentally good, irrespective of what the narrative today is. If that system did not work, that system would have been overthrown long back. And all systems are not same. Just because a Christian system society that is the experience of the West was very negative, does not mean the similar system in India was equally negative. So the men had a more of a role of a livelihood giver, and the women have a role of a nurturer. The women micromanaged affairs of the family and everything. So the good example is Mahabharata, wherein Yudhishthira does not know who he has employed in his palace. All the activities are in the control of Draupadi, his wife. So there is no oppression of women in this society. The roles of men and women are different in a marriage or in a society. In the Hindu conception, yes, they're distinct, but there is no superiority or inferiority. There is no oppression per se. Yes, there would be bad husbands, there could be bad wives also. We have so many examples just today with so many women torturing their husbands, just as so many husbands torturing their wives. So this is the second part. So let us keep away these prejudices that come when we use these concepts of patriarchy and all to whitewash or try to interpret the past. What we see is the question of menstruation, what are the role of women? It's a straightforward answer. Previously, when we were living in a joint family, there were many people in the house. If one was having a menstruation, there are others to take care of that role, whoever that was. Sometimes the husband took the role, sometimes the mother-in-law took the role, and vice versa. Today, in our nuclear families, we are just 2 or 3 people. Like in my house, I am my wife and my little daughter. So what it means, if women have to be given space, rest, and out to whatever extent is possible, then husband has to step in. That is a obvious given. So when it says the Bhartra to Rakshate Yavani, when the husband has to protect the woman, it also means he has to facilitate her to follow her dharma, which includes this 3 dharma of the Rajasala dharma as well. It is a mutual the relationship between husband and wife is mutual cooperation. It is called a sahadharma. Saha means together, doing dharma together. There is no notion of equality that whatever man does, the woman has to do. No, there is a notion of equal cooperation pursuing a common goal when each has their own role, each complement each other, each pursue together, and the fruits are enjoyed by both of them together again. So I think my request is to kind of try to, even for at least for argument's sake, try to step away from what you have been taught in the academia, in the media, and all this feminist narrative about what men and women's role should be or had been and is and all these things. See, reality, there will always be lot of, reality is never white and black. There will always be a lot of gray areas. But we cannot kind of demonize the entire institution which has worked so well for thousands of years and benefited everybody in the system. The best evidence that it has benefited everybody in the system is that except for the last 200 years, there has never been any kind of opposition to the system for throughout the history. Of course, now we can raise a lot of counter arguments to this, and I mean that may be straying away from the actual talk. But the point is, we need to take a nuanced view and try to see things in a more nuanced manner rather than making generalized black and white assertions.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Can I just connect a small question also?
Krishna, we'll give a chance to Kalrav and then to you.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
There are other people as well. So Kalrav, go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, and I'm delighted to tell you that I have reviewed your book as part of my gender and media studies that Nidhi ma'am was teaching me. And just to, show your book to all my, classmates and everyone, there's sir's book that is very eloquent and very insightful. So just take a look at this. Sir, my question to you is that at a critical time when faith seems to be in collision as a matter of fact with so many other individual liberties, how do you see the imposition of a civilization state and the collision of that with the ideal and liberal state? So for example, when state intervenes in the matters of faith, and how a civilization which may or may not be liberal, which of course is arguably, and we can argue on that, but how does that collision looks like, and what is your stand? And I have a follow-up question too, that I have read your book and it's very eloquent and insightful, but I was also curious to know that why the title has been given as Sabrimala, because your pedagogical evolution of menstruation in the Indian perspective has a lot of to do with the academics. And so why that Sabrimala? Because I guess imposing that Sabrimala, it actually kind of demeans the entire exhaustive work that you have laid across.
Thank you. I think I lost you in between the question. Was it, what was your question? Can you just repeat the question part? You mentioned something about civilization state.
Sir, I was mentioning that how the collision between civilizational state and the liberal state that we are right now into. So how does that collision look like, and what is your stand on that, considering the individual liberties point of view?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question, though not related per se, but yeah. See, basically, we have had a civilizational state before the Islamic invasion. Before the Islamic invasion decimated our traditional structures of governance, the kingdoms, had whatever dynasty you take, Mauryans, the Guptas, the Kadambas, or whatever it is, they were a civilizational state. And how is that different from a secular liberal state today? What is a secular state or a liberal state today is basically it is completely deracinated, completely derooted, completely removed from the Indian, from the Hindu cultural values, civilizational values. So it does not fulfill, it does not see itself as fulfilling the aspirations of this civilization, the goals of this civilization, the, the overall well-being of this civilization. For example, in the Kautilyan conception of a state, the duty of the state is called as Yogakshema, and this involves not just the material prosperity, the development and such, but good governance in the sense of Yogakshema involves overall well-being, which includes the dharmic well-being, which includes the well-being in the sense of our aspirations and everything. This is not there today. We are a civilized, a secular state wherein the only goal is development. And there are serious fault lines in our society which is not being addressed, which will not be addressed unless we become a civilizational state. What are those fault lines? For example, let us consider a simple example. For 1,000 years, when the Islamic invasion started in 700, 800 AD, what can be considered as Indian geography, or not in a political sense of a one king ruling all the geography, but in a cultural and religious sense, a civilizational sense of a geography wherein an Indic cultural tradition, an Indic knowledge tradition, Indic civilization had its influence. It extended from Sistan in Soviet Union in somewhere near Afghanistan to Southeast Asian countries. What is the geography wherein Indian civilization is today standing? In a very truncated part of South Asia, right? Forget Southeast Asia, just take Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Pakistan and Bangladesh bifurcation happened just 56, 60, 70 years ago, right? So a secular state has accepted this as a permanent reality. It does not want to speak about the past. We have people, intellectuals, who do not want to speak about Ram Temple, who do not want to speak about Kashi Vishwanath, where our temple, our land is being encroached upon by a structure of an invader's force, invader's community. See, there is nothing against individual community or a religion or whatever it is, but these are the historical facts. So what are the civilizational ethos of our Hindu civilization, of Indian civilization, that we need to recover the lost territories? This is just an example. And we need to set right the domestic problems as well. A civilizational state is a state which aligns itself to the civilizational values which are rooted in Sanatana Dharma. Secular state does not do it. That is why Hindu civilization, Hindu society is in such a mess. Even our temples are not free, right? So this goes into a lot of political problems. So I don't think this is a correct form, and I would like to elaborate in a different form. And regarding the title of the book came in the backdrop of a Shabarimala issue, and that was one of the reasons for putting it. Why the confusion was, the mainstream media narrative was creating this confusion that Shabarimala was about menstruation. Because Hinduism degrades women because of their menstruation, the Shabarimala also is that practice an extension of that. This deliberate manufacture of confusion, I wanted to remove it from the book. So that was the rationale. But I definitely agree that now that we are few years from now, perhaps whenever the second edition, enlarged edition comes out in a few years, that would not be having a Shabarimala confusion, hopefully. See, these are a lot of decisions that publishers take. Authors have a very little role. A lot of marketing considerations are also involved in it. So yeah, that's the story of the title.
Thank you, sir. I look forward to reading the second edition and reviewing it as well. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Yeah, and since you're interested in my thoughts on this civilization state, you may want to check my column on Daily Guardian newspaper. I have written a few articles on what I call the need for a dharmic expansionism and how we need to be more proactive in our strategic and military goals for the next 100 years. So that may interest you.
Sure. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. I guess we have, ma'am, do we have time? We have Diksha, like she's raised hand. So should we take a question?
Yes, we
I
can
can take a question.
We can take question from Diksha. I think Shamika also has put some comments, so we can take that.
Okay, okay.
One or
Diksha,
two
please
questions.
unmute yourself.
Nitinji, you can look at the chat box also. We don't have time to address everything, but you can just glance through the chat box and understand the kind of questions that are coming.
Okay.
We may not have
check
time
the chat box
to.
and quickly answer them.
No, I don't think we'll have time to answer all the comments, observations. We can just read up. We can take Diksha's question. I don't know if somebody else's hand is raised or not, but Diksha and then Shamika to close. Oh, sorry, I think Shamika has a class Shamika has a class at 1, so I will let her go first.
Yeah, no, I don't want to ask
there
question.
is a
I just had
question.
a comment, so I won't be asking any questions. So anyone can fill it. Thank you.
So
I see a question by Nirzari. I think this is relevant to what I said. I just want to clarify. The question is, why is anger, mood swings, irritation only of menstruating women considered ritual impurity and a spiritual incompetence? What about anger, mood swings felt by women on other days and same for women? That's a interesting question and a very accurate question. So there is a fundamental difference between the 3 days of menstruation and the other days. For example, we all get angry, we have a fight and get angry, but we can immediately calm ourselves down and then go to a puja as well, right? Ideally, you should not do puja even on normal days if you are angry. You should first calm yourself down and then do it. But in the case of menstruation, what is happening is, it is not that you're getting angry or irritated because you had a fight or there was some external stimuli. It is because of your own internal condition. There is a heightened condition of Rajoguna. There is a heightened condition of Rajoguna at the level of Manomaya Kosha, which is the mind or Manas. And there is a heightened condition of Rajoguna in the Pranamaya Kosha, which is the Prana of, as I said, the 5 breaths and all those things. And there is a heightened condition of Rajas even in the case of the physical body. So that is why this is considered as incompetence, especially because menstruation is a special case wherein the woman is in a heightened condition of Rajas. But even in generally, normally speaking also, one should not do a puja or anything, japa, anything. It will not fructify if you're too angry, if you're too agitated. You should try to calm yourself down, at least to some extent, and then start your practice. Then the practice itself helps you to calm yourself down further. But a minimum kind of, there are some people, who I've seen some people sitting in front of going to a temple, sitting in front of the deity and cursing somebody else and gossiping. These are the activities, they will give no spiritual merit. If you are sitting in front of the deity and cursing your brother, friend or enemy in the school, college, whatever it is, how is that spiritual, right? You need to be calm even when you go to a temple, when you're standing in front of the Devi or a Devata, whatever it is, you need to be calm even there. Being angry with the Devata is a completely different thing that comes under bhakti, but this is different. I hope that answers that question.
Can I read out? Shamika is teaching with us, and she's saying that this structure or given system has always benefited some few. So it's a very top-down approach of saying that it has benefited everyone. There are so many people who have been structurally oppressed in the system. Going away from modernism also includes the notion of going away from the system. So your comments
I
on that,
already
Nitin.
mentioned, yeah. I just want to add this. I already mentioned this, that no system is perfect. There will always be in a system, there will always be those who are more benefited, those who are less benefited. Because that is the how social dynamics works. It is not at all about a top-down approach. In fact, the social systems are organically developed. Just because some text says something, that does not mean people will have that system on the ground. The system on the ground develops organically. Take it the jati system, take it the man-woman dynamics within the system of a family. It is a system which is organically developed on the ground. And all systems are basically, all relationships are basically, there are power dynamics involved in it. There are sometimes some people, some communities, some families have upper hand, sometimes the others have the upper hand. This is the ground reality. We should di- distinguish between the ideal that our shastras provide and the reality on the ground. The reality must, we have to try to strive to uh, bring in a system which is as close to ideal as possible, but it is never 100%. It is not possible, just like a combustion theory in science. I don't know how many are aware of physics. In the physics, the combustion engine, it is never 100%. It never gives 100%. It cannot convert the input 100% into output. If you think the modern system, then we are living in a self-told lie. There are hundreds of problems today which were simply absent in a pre-modern society. They were simply absent. Today, you see a lot of women in their 40s trying to conceive children using a lot of medical, and they are not able to do it. They are trying to, they're going to one doctor after another doctor, third doctor, fourth doctor, they are not able to do it. And there are a lot of complications in that. I'm just giving this as an example. But this problem was completely absent in a pre-modern society. I'm not saying that was better, this is wrong. See, that is a different debate. There is a possibility scope for knowing the pros and cons of pre-modern society, traditional society, and today's society. Take a go. There are in many ways today's society is very bad. Take ecology for example. We have completely decimated the nature. We have completely decimated ecology in the last 250, 300 years since the industrial revolution. Can we say that modernity is better than ancient system? See, there are different parameters. So, taking upon completely gender issue, let us come to the gender issue. There were a lot of issues in the past. Many were oppressed, if I have to use your word. True. But are not people being oppressed today? I can tell about my own far relative, a male relative, who was oppressed in his marriage by his wife, physically tortured. And with great difficulty, he got a divorce. So, should I say that then, taking this one example as a generalization and say, we should never allow for a matrilineal society because women will oppress? See, that is a very that is a mischaracterization. That conclusion does not follow from the evidence. The reverse is equally true. Just because you can find certain issues in the society, that does not mean that there is some villain in the form of a man or in the form of a structure. That structure is inherently violent. See, violence is inherent in the nature itself. See, if you read Panchatantra and the Niti Shastras, what they teach us, they do not teach us there is some kind of utopia wherein there is zero violence. They teach us that the nature, the Mahabharata as well, the nature by definition is violent. The life is by definition is violent. They teach us to negotiate through this violence. negotiate this violence in as ethical way as possible. Ethics or dharma is our only anchor. But absolute non-violence is not possible. Just imagine the mosquito sits on your cheeks and you just kill it. That is violence. Do you say? Do you show the other the cheek and say, please bite me here as well? No. The point I am trying to make it. These are very complicated issues. Yes, there have been a lot of misuse of the system, so to speak. There have been, all systems are problematic in some way. There cannot be ideal system. But it is wrong to say that somehow one particular system which has functioned, rightly or wrongly, it has functioned for thousands of years, is suddenly the mother of all the problems in the world. And somehow the replacement, the alternative to it will be a panacea, will be a solution to every problem. That is a utopian, that does not happen. It is not practical. We see so many problems even today. Just imagine in the West, in the name of women's liberation and freedom, what is happening? They are fighting for women's right to kill in the name of abortion. Abortion is killing. There is no doubt about it. Whether there could be situations when abortion is necessary, no doubt. I am not denying it. I have talked about it, and you can check my videos on YouTube on my 4-part article on it. But there is no doubt that fetus is being killed. Can we ethically justify this killing in the name of rights? Can anybody has a right to kill? If one has a right to kill a fetus, then a murderer can say that I have a right to kill an adult person. These are all called in ethics, these are all slippery slope, arguments of slippery slope. So we need to be very careful without generalizing, we need to be very careful to have a nuanced approach. So this is just a point I want to make.
Okay, I think we have time for only one question.
Okay, let me
Ma'am.
just Nandini this question. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Yes, sir. So should I read it out?
Yeah, I am just reading. Okay, you can read it out. I'll just read it.
So Nandini is saying that gynecologists say that it's okay to have sex while on periods with wish and consent, and there's no scientific evidence that it is harmful. Certain studies or articles suggest that there are a few benefits too of that. Even yoga, meditation, certain specific exercises help in period discomfort. So I wish to ask that while looking through the Indic paradigm, should we not take into account certain scientific reasons?
Okay, good question. I suggest you read my book. I have answered this question there. There are certain scientific studies which also say that having sexual intercourse during the menstruation could be problematic, especially in terms of if there is a conception post those 3 periods, because the semen can stay for a few days, and in such case there could be conception. And if modern science, modern biology is science, modern medicine is science, then Ayurveda is also science. Just because the Ayurvedic basis is different from modern medicine, allopathic medicine, does not mean that Ayurveda is a non-science. So this is another of a brainwashing, so to speak, the modern education does, that only a particular narrative of science, particular way of doing science is science. And only that is truth. You attach truth value or value of validity to what is called as science in the modern sense, but the rest are rejected as falsehood. Ayurveda is not falsehood. Hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people have benefited for thousands of years. Even today, they are benefited. You cannot simply say that it is false. So Ayurveda clearly mentions why it is problematic and how it could affect. And there is, of course, I gave many other reasons for avoiding sex during periods. It is not just about medical issue, but also other issues like I mentioned about how menstruation itself is a tapasya. So if you want to treat it as a tapasya, then you have to practice celibacy on that time. Otherwise, it won't be a tapasya. Secondly, regarding the question of yoga, meditation, and all, see, certain exercises may help in period discomfort. But what the Ayurveda says is an ideal menstruation is one wherein you will not have any physical discomfort. The period, there will not be any pain and etc. Because your lifestyle is such that there is no imbalance in the dosha. So now it is possible that certain exercises, certain yoga postures may help you to achieve that, become free of that pain. But in the long run, you have to adopt the lifestyle that Ayurveda and other texts say, so that you don't come to the discomfort in the first place at all. Prevention is better than cure. Second, whatever the studies may suggest, the fact is meditation or any other ritualistic effort that you do, the process is same. It pushes your apana to move upwards. But during menstruation, your apana moves downwards, and it should move downwards. So there is interference in the working of the apana vayu, which will affect the working of the menstrual cycle. But the problem is apana vayu is not visible in the naked eye. You cannot use any medical instruments or equipments and machines and tools of modern science to measure it. Therefore, you cannot actually use modern studies to see the workings of the apana. You have to take it, understand it on the basis of the Ayurveda and the pramana system of within the Ayurveda system. So the fundamental issue is that we do not understand the notion of pramana. Pramana means basically source of knowledge. One pramana is pratyaksha, that is direct perception. The other is anumana, which is logical inference. The modern scientific methodologies comes under pratyaksha and anumana. But these are not the only source of knowledge. In Indian tradition, we have what is called as Shabda Pramana or Shastra Pramana, the textual source of knowledge, and they are equally valid. So we need to bring, that's a different discussion, and I have again given some talks on this. You can check my YouTube channel as well. So these are different discussion, individual discussions, to technical discussions to go into there. Yeah. I can take one last questions if there are any, and then we can.
Nitinji, I think Diksha has a question, but I'm not sure if we will be able to accommodate it. Very briefly, I just want to know, what is the limitation of the Indic perspective on menstruation? If we were to study the limitations of the Indic perspective on menstruation, again from an Indic lens, not from a Western colonial lens, what are the limitations?
What exactly does he mean by limitations? So then
as in, what are the cons, or on what basis can we critique it? If we were to critique it indigenously.
See, there is nothing to critique, See, there is no cons at all. If you practice it, it is beneficial. You can see it benefited in your life, For example, the Ayurvedic paricharyas, since many people like modern science, there were studies conducted on some 25 plus details in my book are mentioned, wherein as 25 girls in the age of I think 20 to 30 years or something, they had series of issues associated with their menstrual cycles, with pain, cramp, and pimples, and so many other things. So after 6 months of practicing Ayurveda Paricharya, the lifestyle practices of do's and don'ts, in all of them, they saw their symptoms vanishing away. Around 95 to 99% of symptoms vanishing away, without any pills, without any drugs, without any injections, without stuffing your body with chemicals. naturally by just this lifestyle change. So if such a lifestyle is beneficial to you, what can be a con to it? Right? There is no con in it. There is no limitation. There cannot be a critic of it. Why there cannot? See, the only critic you can do is you reject the whole thing by saying that this does not, you cannot verify it using modern scientific mechanisms. So all these are superstition. That is the only way you can actually reject it. There is no other way, because these are all fundamental things. One is Ayurveda. A lot of people have practiced it for a long period of time, and firsthand they have experienced the benefits. And then there is a Shastra Pramana. On the question of dharma and adharma, Shastras are ultimate Pramana. If the Shastra, Veda and all saying something is so, it is so. Because by definition, what the Shastras say, it cannot be contradicted by other means of knowledge, like Pratyaksha and Anumana, etc. So there is no critique. There cannot be, there is no limitation or a critique of it in an indigenous way. You can, only thing can be done is, there can be difference in interpretation of certain tenets of these things. That is always there. But there is no rejection of the entire system.
Okay, thank you so much. So we are now moving towards the close of the session. It's almost close to 2 hours, so we have to close the session. So I invite Komal to deliver the formal vote of thanks.
Thank you, sir, for answering all the questions and for sharing the thoughts and opinions on this very age-old topic. I'm sure the students have learned a lot, and many of the questions which were not answered earlier or which were, like always a doubt, have been answered with your session. On behalf of the entire faculty and the students all together, I would like to express my heartfelt thanks to you, sir. And we look forward for such meaningful interactions in future as well. And I'm sure that for any questions further, the students can connect with you, as well as you said, that there are YouTube series like where you have given talks or delivered talks. So we would check all of them. And if we have questions, I'm sure the students will connect with you in future. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nitinji. I think this session has raised more questions in the minds of our students. And I think that should be the purpose of any academic deliberation. I also feel that it has exposed them to an Indic perspective. I believe that this is the first time that they've been exposed to an Indic perspective, and that's very useful, because otherwise, the only perspective that exists around us is the modern scientific Western perspective. Post-study is also important, but we also need to think about perspectives that are indigenous and that we can explore. So I believe personally that this is more like self-exploration. I believe you have undergone that journey of self-exploration, and unless all of us go through the self-exploration, we'll keep raising questions, and probably we'll keep coming back to you also. So thank you so much for agreeing to do this session at such a short notice. I definitely know that you are an extremely busy person and you have a lot of other academic as well as intellectual engagement. So thank you for making time out for our students and this session in particular. So we hope to keep in touch. The students can pick up Nitinji's books. I think they are available on Amazon and Flipkart, and they can connect with him on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Great. So thank you, everyone. Thanks to everyone who participated.
Thank you, Nidhi. I extremely enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
Bye. Bye, everyone. Take care.